My wife sold our family home while I was away. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. My key wouldn't turn in the lock of the house I spent 6 years paying for. I had just completed a grueling, 6-month engineering contract in the blistering heat of Dubai. I was completely exhausted, my muscles aching from 80-hour work weeks, but my heart felt incredibly light. I had flown home a week early to surprise my wife, Vanessa. Our beautiful 4-bedroom craftsman home in the quiet suburbs was supposed to be our forever sanctuary. I stood on the familiar welcome mat, my heavy canvas duffel bag slung over my exhausted shoulder, staring at the polished brass doorknob. I jiggled the metal key again, assuming the old deadbolt was just being stubborn like it always used to be. It wasn't. The lock had been completely replaced. A cold, sharp spike of adrenaline shot straight through my chest. Had there been a violent break-in? Was Vanessa safe? I dropped my heavy bag onto the porch and reached for my phone. But before I could even dial her number, the front door swung wide open. A man in his late 30s, wearing a faded college t-shirt and holding a crying toddler on his hip, stared back at me. We looked at each other in total, paralyzing confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he took in my dusty work boots and the luggage resting on his pristine porch. I blinked hard, my jet-lagged brain struggling to process the surreal scene unfolding in front of my own eyes. "I think there's been a massive misunderstanding," I stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the address numbers bolted securely next to the door. "I live here. I'm Arthur. Where's my wife, Vanessa?" The man shifted the crying toddler higher on his hip, his expression shifting rapidly from mild confusion to a deep, uncomfortable wariness. He looked past me, glancing up and down the quiet suburban street, as if looking for a hidden prank camera. "Buddy, I don't know who Vanessa is," he said slowly, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. "But you definitely do not live in this house. Have you ever watched your entire life vanish on a piece of paper?" Because in that exact moment, the foundation of my reality began to violently crumble beneath my feet. I desperately insisted that this was my property, that I had been paying the heavy mortgage for 6 straight years. The stranger looked at me and said he bought this house 2 weeks ago. The crushing weight of his words forced the air completely out of my lungs. My mind immediately violently flashed back to the day I left for the overseas engineering contract. Vanessa and I had been married for 4 years, and the financial stress had been quietly slowly eating away at the foundation of our relationship. We had maxed out our credit cards to furnish this very house, and the ballooning mortgage payments were suffocating us. When the Dubai contract was offered to me, it felt like a miraculous lifeline. It paid triple my normal salary, plus a massive completion bonus that would entirely wipe out our remaining debt. I sat Vanessa down at our kitchen island, holding her hands, and promised her that 6 months of painful distance would buy us a lifetime of absolute financial freedom. She had cried, burying her face in my shoulder, whispering how much she would miss me and how proud she was of my sacrifice. Because I was going to be working on a remote, highly secure site with extremely limited internet access, we met with a local notary. I signed a limited power of attorney document, granting Vanessa the legal authority to manage our finances, handle the mortgage, and make emergency property decisions in my absence. I trusted her implicitly, completely blinding myself to the underlying greed that had always lurked just beneath her polished surface. I thought I was being a responsible, providing husband, ensuring my wife was protected if a disaster struck while I was halfway across the world. I spent 6 agonizing months sweating in the desert sun, missing birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries, entirely fueled by the thought of returning to our beautiful home and my loving wife. Every exhausting shift was dedicated to our future. Every dollar saved was a brick in the fortress I thought I was building for us. I meticulously transferred my entire paycheck into our joint checking account every single Friday, without fail. I had no idea that piece of paper was my own financial death warrant. The stranger on my porch, sensing my absolute, world-shattering panic, gently set his toddler down inside the foyer and pulled the heavy front door mostly shut behind him. He introduced himself as Mark, and seeing the genuine horror painted across my pale face, he asked me to wait right there on the steps. 2 minutes later, he returned holding a thick, blue manila folder. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble, Mark said defensively, holding the folder tightly to his chest. We used a legitimate real estate agency. We went through a proper title company. Everything was done by the absolute book. He opened the folder and handed me a pristine copy of the final closing settlement statement. My hands trembled violently as I scanned the dense, black text. The date of the sale was listed as exactly 14 days ago. The seller was listed as Arthur and Vanessa, but on the signature line, my name was scrawled out in a handwriting that I intimately recognized. Vanessa had signed it, explicitly citing the power of attorney document I had so foolishly granted her. Have you ever felt your own blood turn to ice in your veins? I stared at the top of the crisp document, my eyes locking onto the glossy, colorful letterhead of the brokerage that handled the massive transaction. It was a premium agency located just 2 towns over, and the listing agent's name was printed in bold, arrogant letters, Derek Vance. The numbers on the page were completely sickening. The house had been sold fully furnished for $650,000. The remaining mortgage had been quickly paid off, leaving a massive cash payout in escrow. The math aggressively spun in my head as I realized she had liquidated everything we owned while I was sweating in the desert. I handed the heavy closing documents back to the confused, apologetic stranger, my entire body going completely numb from the devastating shock. I was standing on my own porch, but I was now legally a homeless man. I stumbled blindly down the concrete driveway, the wheels of my heavy canvas suitcase rattling loudly against the pavement. I climbed into my car, a 6-year-old sedan that had been sitting untouched in long-term airport parking, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped my phone twice before I could successfully unlock the screen. I immediately dialed Vanessa's cell phone number, desperate for her to pick up, and explain that this was all some massive, horrifying clerical error. The call didn't even ring. A harsh, automated voice immediately informed me that the number had been permanently disconnected and was no longer in service. Panic clawed brutally at my throat as I frantically opened my mobile banking application. I typed in my password, holding my breath, praying to see the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had wired home over the last 6 grueling months. The screen loaded, displaying our primary joint checking account and our linked savings account. Both balances stared back at me in cruel, mocking digital digits, $0. 00. Every single dime of my overseas salary was completely gone. The massive cash payout from the fraudulent house sale was completely gone. The emergency fund we had built together over 4 years was completely gone. She had systematically drained every single account to the absolute zero mark. I was 34 years old, entirely exhausted from a brutal international job, and I literally only had the $60 in my physical wallet to my name. I drove away from the beautiful house I had painstakingly paid for, navigating blindly through the familiar suburban streets through a thick veil of angry tears. I eventually pulled into the crumbling parking lot of a cheap, neon-lit motel on the depressing outskirts of the city. I paid for a single night using an emergency credit card I kept hidden in my travel bag. I sat alone on the edge of the sagging, stained mattress in the dim room. I stared at the peeling wallpaper, wondering how the woman I loved erased me entirely. I barely slept a single minute that horrible night, my mind violently racing through every possible scenario of betrayal. The next morning, fueled by cheap diner coffee and a rapidly growing sense of cold fury, I drove straight back to my old neighborhood. I didn't go to my house. I parked down the street and walked up to the driveway of my next-door neighbor, Dave. Dave was a retired mechanic in his late 50s, a sharp-eyed, observant guy who spent most of his days meticulously restoring classic cars in his open garage. When he saw me walking up his driveway, his jaw literally dropped in sheer, absolute astonishment. "Arthur, what in the hell are you doing back here so soon?" Dave asked, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty shop towel. "Vanessa told everyone on the street you took an extension on your contract and were moving permanently to Dubai." I quickly explained the nightmare. The empty house, the strangers, the totally drained bank accounts. Dave's expression darkened, and he let out a long, heavy sigh, leaning against the hood of his Mustang. "I knew something was deeply wrong, Arthur. The second month you were gone, things changed drastically over there." Dave proceeded to tell me that Vanessa had started throwing wild, loud parties on the weekends. But more importantly, he noticed a silver, brand-new BMW constantly parked in my driveway overnight. Slick-looking guy, expensive suits, acted like he owned the damn place. Dave muttered angrily. About 3 weeks ago, a massive moving truck showed up at dawn. They loaded up all your good furniture, the expensive electronics, everything. They left the cheap stuff for the staging. Dave walked over to his heavy metal toolbox, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a glossy, crumpled piece of heavy cardstock paper. This blew into my yard the day they were moving out. I kept it because the guy rubbed me the absolute wrong way. Dave handed me a flyer he found in the driveway with the realtor's smiling face. The glossy flyer featured the arrogant, professionally whitened smile of Derek Vance, the exact same real estate agent listed on the closing documents I saw on my porch. The puzzle pieces were violently slamming together, forming a picture of ultimate, sickening betrayal. I didn't waste another second. I immediately searched for the most aggressive, highly rated asset recovery attorney in the city and booked an emergency consultation. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from lawyer Sarah in her sterile, imposing downtown office. Sarah was in her late 40s, incredibly sharp, strictly business, and possessed the intense demeanor of a shark smelling fresh blood in the water. I laid out the entire timeline, the power of attorney document, the empty bank accounts, and the glossy real estate flyer featuring Derek Vance. Sarah didn't offer empty sympathies. She immediately booted up her computer and accessed the county's secure real estate transaction database. If she used a power of attorney to sell a marital asset, there has to be an airtight paper trail, Sarah muttered, her fingers flying rapidly across her mechanical keyboard. After 10 minutes of intense searching, she pulled up the detailed wire transfer records from the escrow payout. The entire sum of $450,000 had not gone into our joint account. It had been systematically routed through a domestic shell corporation and immediately wired to a brand new, entirely hidden offshore account located in the Bahamas. She didn't just sell your house, Arthur, Sarah said, pointing a manicured finger sharply at the glowing screen. She committed aggressive wire fraud and likely committed severe perjury on the spousal consent forms required by the title company to bypass your physical signature. The sheer, calculated magnitude of Vanessa's crime was absolutely breathtaking. She hadn't acted out of sudden panic. She had meticulously planned my absolute financial destruction. Sarah looked up from the documents and told me we were dealing with federal crimes. Armed with the undeniable legal proof of the fraudulent offshore transfer, my desperation rapidly morphed into a dangerous, calculated obsession. When I returned to my depressing motel room that evening, I opened my laptop and began a deep, obsessive dive into Derek Vance's digital footprint. His primary business social media profiles were aggressively sanitized, showing nothing but successfully sold houses, motivational quotes, and his gleaming silver BMW. But I am a methodical engineer. I know how to aggressively dig beneath the polished surface. I searched his followers, cross-referencing obscure usernames until I struck absolute gold. I found a secondary, heavily locked-down private profile under a slightly altered variation of his middle name. Using a dummy account I had created years ago for a tech project, I managed to view the public profile picture and a few unlocked tag photos. The images hit me with the physical force of a speeding freight train. There was Derek, deeply tanned and grinning arrogantly, sitting on the pristine deck of a luxury catamaran. And sitting right beside him, wearing expensive designer sunglasses and holding a tropical cocktail, was my wife, Vanessa. The timestamp on the photo was from exactly 4 days ago. While I was frantically wandering the streets with my luggage, completely legally homeless and utterly financially ruined, she was laughing in the Caribbean. Have you ever felt the exact moment your heart violently turns to cold, unyielding stone? I stared at her bright, carefree smile, realizing that every single "I miss you" text she sent me over the last 6 months was typed while she was in bed with him. She had used my grueling, painful labor to completely fund her tropical fantasy life with a sleazy real estate broker. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. The deep, agonizing grief was instantly incinerated by a massive, overwhelming wave of pure, toxic anger. My wife was toasting her new life with the man who stole my entire world. The next morning, I marched back into lawyer Sarah's imposing downtown office, completely devoid of any remaining sorrow. The grief had burned away completely, leaving behind a cold, intensely calculated desire for absolute destruction. I showed Sarah the printed screenshots of Vanessa and Derek drinking expensive cocktails in the sunny Bahamas. Sarah reviewed the photos, a tight, dangerous smile slowly spreading across her sharp face. We have the wire fraud. We have the blatant perjury on the spousal consent forms, and we have the obvious, gross abuse of fiduciary duty regarding the power of attorney, Sarah listed methodically. But there is a major logistical problem, Arthur. The money is currently sitting in a Bahamian account, completely outside of our immediate legal jurisdiction. She leaned forward, resting her elbows firmly on her pristine glass desk. If we simply go to the federal authorities right now, Vanessa and Derek will immediately catch wind of the investigation. They will move the stolen funds to an untraceable crypto wallet and vanish into a non-extradition country before the FBI can even draft the necessary warrants. I clenched my fists tightly in my lap, understanding the brutal reality of international asset recovery. We needed to forcefully drag them back onto American soil, into a highly controlled environment where we could completely ambush them legally and financially. We cannot chase them, Sarah declared, her eyes glinting with aggressive, strategic brilliance. We have to make them willingly walk right back into the lion's den. We need a reason for them to board a flight and walk straight into my conference room. I thought about Vanessa. I thought about the relentless, consuming materialism that had slowly destroyed our marriage and ultimately led her to commit massive federal fraud. We needed a bait so irresistible that her greed would overpower her sense of caution. For 3 agonizing days, I meticulously played the role of the broken, completely defeated husband, waiting in the shadows for her to make the first move. Finally, an email violently pinged into my primary inbox. It was from a brand new, securely encrypted email address, but the subject line simply read, "I'm so incredibly sorry, Arthur." I opened it, my blood instantly boiling as I read her carefully crafted, sickeningly manipulative lies. Vanessa claimed she was deeply ashamed. She claimed the credit card debt had secretly spiraled completely out of control, that loan sharks were aggressively threatening her, and she had to sell the house in a total panic just to survive. She conveniently omitted the Bahamian vacation and the sleazy real estate agent. She painted herself as the tragic, terrified victim of circumstance, hoping my deeply ingrained loyalty would blind me to the actual facts. "I am staying with a friend out of state until I can figure out how to fix this horrible mess," she lied smoothly. I took a deep, steadying breath and began to type my carefully constructed reply. I couldn't afford to sound angry or suspicious. I had to sound utterly pathetic. I wrote back, saying I was totally heartbroken, but that I ultimately understood the terrible pressure she must have been under. I told her I didn't want to involve the angry police or fight aggressively in court. I told her I just wanted peaceful closure and a clean, amicable divorce so we could both quietly move on with our heavily damaged lives. Every single word tasted like toxic ash in my mouth, but I forced myself to aggressively play the role of the naive, blindly forgiving fool. I needed her to believe that she had completely gotten away with the perfect, flawless crime. I typed my pathetic response, knowing she would read it and think I was weak. Less than 12 hours later, Vanessa quickly replied, her tone noticeably relieved and sickeningly sweet. She eagerly agreed that an amicable, quiet divorce was the best path forward for both of us. This was the exact opening I had been painstakingly waiting for. I immediately drafted my next email, carefully loading the lethal, undeniable bait that Sarah and I had meticulously constructed. "Vanessa," I wrote, "there is one major financial complication we need to sort out immediately. The engineering company in Dubai was so incredibly thrilled with my early project completion that they are paying out a massive, unprecedented $300,000 performance bonus." I paused, letting the heavy weight of that fake, massive number fully sink into the text. Because this bonus was legally earned during the time frame of our marriage, my corporate attorney says you are technically entitled to exactly half of it. However, the corporate holding company strictly requires both spouses to sign the final divorce settlement and the financial release forms in person, in front of a licensed attorney, before the massive funds can be released from escrow. Have you ever set a trap so completely obvious that only pure, unadulterated greed could blind the prey? I knew Vanessa was currently sitting on over $400,000 of stolen house money, but I also knew her insatiable appetite for wealth. The absolute prospect of casually collecting another fast, easy $150,000 for doing absolutely nothing would be entirely impossible for her to resist. She wouldn't be able to stand the thought of leaving that much cash sitting securely on the table. I hit send on the fake bonus email and waited for her greed to bite. The trap worked perfectly, far better than even lawyer Sarah had aggressively anticipated. Vanessa replied within a mere 20 minutes. The feigned guilt and the pathetic victim narrative completely vanished, instantly replaced by a sharp, highly demanding tone. She stated she was absolutely willing to sign the divorce papers to secure her rightful and fair share of the corporate completion bonus. But she added a crucial, incredibly arrogant stipulation. Given the sensitive, highly complex nature of our financial separation, she wrote, I will be bringing my personal financial advisor with me to thoroughly review the corporate release documents before I sign anything. I practically laughed out loud in the dark, depressing motel room. Her financial advisor was obviously Derek. She was so completely emboldened by her successful theft that she was actually bringing her lover, the very man who helped steal my house, right to the meeting to ensure she squeezed every last fake dime out of me. I forwarded the email directly to Sarah, who immediately confirmed the meeting time for the following Tuesday at her heavily secured downtown law firm. The sheer, blinding arrogance of their plan was absolutely staggering. They believed I was a broken, spineless pushover who was willingly handing them a massive fortune just to make the emotional pain stop. They believed they held all the cards, entirely unaware that the deck had been completely rigged against them from the very start. They were packing their expensive designer bags, leaving their luxury Bahamian resort, and eagerly booking first-class tickets back to the United States. They were flying back to America to steal money that didn't even actually exist. Tuesday morning arrived with a cold, relentless downpour, fitting the dark, heavy mood of the impending confrontation. I sat rigidly inside Sarah's massive, intimidating glass conference room, my heart aggressively pounding against my ribs like a trapped hammer. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy glass doors confidently swung open. Vanessa walked in first, wearing a designer trench coat and sporting a deep, expensive tropical tan. Derek strutted in confidently right behind her, wearing a tailored, overly slick suit and a smug, patronizing smile. They looked completely relaxed, entirely unbothered by the sheer devastation they had intentionally caused. Vanessa offered me a brief, completely fake look of rehearsed sympathy before taking her seat aggressively across the large oak table. Derek sat right next to her, opening his expensive leather briefcase with an air of complete, arrogant authority. Sarah, playing the role of the neutral, accommodating corporate mediator flawlessly, warmly welcomed them to the firm. Before we can begin reviewing the massive corporate bonus release documents, Sarah stated smoothly, sliding a small stack of papers across the polished table, I need both of you to physically sign these standard identity verification and presence forms for our internal legal compliance records. Derek didn't even bother to read the fine print. He confidently clicked his expensive designer pen and rapidly signed his name, eager to get to the massive payout. Vanessa eagerly followed suit, violently scribbling her signature across the bottom line. I watched them hand the heavily inked documents back to lawyer Sarah, feeling a massive, dark wave of absolute satisfaction wash over my tense body. The moment the ink dried on those forms, the trap officially snapped entirely shut. Sarah carefully collected the signed identity documents, placed them neatly into a manila folder, and deliberately locked it inside her desk drawer. Then, her warm, accommodating demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying, absolute frigid coldness. She picked up a remote control and firmly pressed a button. The heavy blinds on the conference room windows aggressively snapped shut, and a massive projector screen smoothly lowered from the ceiling. There is no $300,000 corporate bonus, Sarah announced, her voice echoing loudly like a physical gunshot in the suddenly dark room. Vanessa's fake, polite smile immediately faltered, replaced by a sharp look of intense confusion. What are you talking about? Arthur said. Vanessa started, but Sarah aggressively cut her off. Arthur lied to bring your thieving assets back into my legal jurisdiction, Sarah stated fiercely. She clicked the remote, and the massive screen loudly illuminated with the undeniable evidence. First, the glossy real estate flyer featuring Derek's arrogant face. Then, the heavily forged spousal consent documents. And finally, the massive, highly detailed wire transfer routing the $450,000 from the house sale directly into the hidden Bahamian bank account. Derek's smug, tanned face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickening, pale shade of gray. While you two were eagerly flying back to claim a fake bonus, Sarah continued, her voice dripping with absolute venom. My federal contacts were actively presenting this massive evidence of wire fraud to a federal judge. As of 20 minutes ago, your offshore Bahamian accounts have been completely, legally frozen by the FBI. Vanessa's smug smile vanished as she realized she was not getting a single dime. The realization of their total, absolute financial and legal destruction hit the room like a massive, explosive shockwave. Total, unfiltered chaos immediately violently erupted. Vanessa leaped entirely out of her leather chair, her face contorted in sheer, unadulterated panic, screaming at me that I couldn't legally do this to her. But the absolute best part of the entire trap was watching the fake, sleazy alliance between the two thieves instantly violently crumble. Derek, realizing his lucrative real estate license, his massive freedom, and his entire life were entirely over, immediately threw Vanessa right under the heavy bus. I had absolutely no idea. Derek shrieked wildly, aggressively pointing a shaking finger directly at my wife. She explicitly told me Arthur completely legally consented to the sale. She provided the power of attorney. She manipulated the entire deal. Vanessa spun around, her eyes wide with total, shocking betrayal, and violently lunged at him, violently slapping his shoulder. You cowardly bastard! You planned the whole offshore transfer. She screamed hysterically. Sarah just stood completely still, calmly watching the two rats violently tear each other apart in the sinking ship of their own massive greed. You can aggressively argue about who orchestrated the massive fraud when you speak to the authorities, Sarah stated loudly over the screaming. Because signing those identity forms legally confirmed your physical presence in this building to the federal agents waiting in the lobby. Right on absolute cue, the heavy conference room doors aggressively swung open, and three stern-faced federal investigators stepped into the room. I sat in silence and watched my former wife get escorted out in silver handcuffs. It has been 8 long, incredibly difficult months since that explosive, terrifying morning in Sarah's downtown conference room. The legal aftermath was a slow, incredibly tedious nightmare, but justice was ultimately served. Because the sale was proven to be a massive, calculated fraud involving heavily forged spousal consent, the title insurance company was aggressively forced to completely unwind the transaction. The confused family living in my house was entirely refunded, and the physical deed was legally rightfully restored exclusively to my name. Derek Vance permanently lost his real estate license and is currently desperately attempting to plead down his massive federal wire fraud charges. Vanessa is sitting in a federal holding facility, completely bankrupt and entirely facing a significant, lengthy prison sentence for her aggressive, calculated perjury and massive theft. The healing process for me has been incredibly slow and deeply painful. Walking back into my empty, totally unfurnished house for the first time felt like stepping into a cold, haunted graveyard of my former life. I had to completely rebuild my sanctuary from absolute scratch. I learned the hardest, most devastating lesson a man can possibly learn about the absolute limits of blind faith. Love is an incredibly beautiful, vital thing, but a legally binding document is a loaded, incredibly dangerous weapon. If you are leaving your home, firmly protect your massive assets with aggressive, ironclad legal boundaries. Never assume the person smiling at you is completely immune to the dark, consuming poison of extreme greed. Trust your partner completely, but never give anyone the legal power to erase your existence.